Hello, everybody. This is Professor Collins, and this is our review of Chapter 1 with our textbook. When we're talking about mass communication, for this class, we are especially interested in taking a critical approach. We are looking at the media, we are looking at what we are seeing and why we're seeing it. So, what exactly is mass media? And how does it reflect and shape our world? These are the questions that we want to continually ask during this semester. So, how does it shape our world, your world? How does it reflect your world? What stories do you see that speak to you? What things do you hear that speak to you or that interest you? What things have maybe influenced your life or your family's life? We also want to discuss the role and responsibility that the mass media have. What is the role that it plays? What is the role that it should play? And how, if at all, should these processes or these roles be changed? I think when we look at certain things that have been in the news, we can see very much how the media can impact our lives. If you look at things like the Black Lives Matter protests, the protests over the Eric Garner decision, or the protests over the Ferguson decisions, those are examples of how mass media can shape our world and reflect what's going on in the world. Of course, we all come to the table with different experiences, different viewpoints, and different things that interest us. So it will be interesting during the semester to look at that. Now, media can be good and bad. At the worst, media can sometimes erode the quality of life, meaning there are sometimes when things happen in the media or are reflected in the media that are negative, that do not show off the best parts of us. Think of media takeout, for example, which is, totally full of gossip, and it tends to reflect the worst side of life, if you will. But there are also good things because media can help us understand things. It can help illuminate certain issues. It can also help us understand and learn about trends. So it's important that our media literacy is up to date and that we're keeping up with what's happening and what's being discussed. To stick our head in the sand just because things seem to be bad or seem to be negative is to sort of miss the point and to miss out on a lot of what's going on in the world. And remember that the wonderful thing, especially about media now, is that we really can have a say in not only the role that media plays in our lives, but even in terms of what's being reflected in the media. We have more power than ever before. Things like Twitter, Facebook, especially Instagram, are all ways that we can comment immediately on what's going on, what's being said, and how it's being said. And that's an important responsibility that we all need to remember and recognize. Now, what are we talking about with mass media and mass communications? This is a definition that you definitely need to know and need to memorize. Mass media are industries that create and distribute information to large numbers of people. Now, that's important to understand, the whole thing of large numbers of people, okay? So you're not talking about a personal letter or a conversation between two people. You're talking about something that's going out to a large audience. And whenever you are doing your definitions in your essays that are going to come up this semester, you always need to keep that definition in mind. Okay? You're talking about a large number of people that this information is going out to. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about things like books, music, newspapers, movies, the internet. We're talking about television, of course, magazines, and any other products that go to a large number of people. So somebody had asked me online, would I include, say, a phone tree or something, or a robocall that goes out to employees in a company. And while that may go out to a lot of people, it doesn't go out to everyone. Okay? So with mass media, you really want to think in terms of things that go out or can be accessed by everyone. Okay? Now, mass communication, of course, is the creation and use of symbols that are used to convey the information to this large and diverse audience. Okay? So, mass media is the industries that create and distribute the information to large numbers of people. Mass communication is the creation and the use of the symbols that convey the information. All right? So hopefully that makes more sense to you. For our purposes, we are focusing on mass media. Okay? Now, let's talk about the evolution of mass communication. When we talk about communication, we usually discuss it in terms of 5 eras. 5. The earliest era would be the oral era, the oral tradition. This is when stories and traditions were handed down. People, you had philosophers and tribal storytellers that would talk about, traditions and stories within a tribe or within a community. But this would not be considered a form of mass media, because if you're talking about an oral tradition, it's limited to a small number of people. Okay? Even if the stories are handed down from person to person, it's not like everybody in the whole world has access to that story. So, the earliest form of communication would be the oral era, but this is not a form of mass communication. The second era in communication is known as the written era. Now here, we're talking about handwritten, okay? So we're talking about like handwritten scripts, handwritten notes, handwritten documents, okay? And of course, since they were written by hand, they weren't able to be mass produced. So even though possibly more people may be able to read these manuscripts, it's still limited in the number of people that have access to it. So the written era is also not considered a form of mass communication. Now, the forms of mass communication really start with the print era. Okay? This is when the printing press was discovered and became popular. We trace the beginnings of the printing press back to the 15th century when Gutenberg started printing things on the printing press. And the first books to be printed on the printing presses were the Bible. So when we have a quiz, and if I ask you what were the earliest books, the Bible. That's the answer. The Gutenberg Bible is the oldest book that is known to exist that was published through a printing press. Now, when we talk about the emergence of the print era, we also start to see the spread of literacy. Literacy literally is the ability to read and write. You have to remember that in earlier generations, the value of literacy was something that was considered to be more of the realm of the upper class, or those who could afford the time to learn to read and write. If you were a poorer person, your focus was more on just trying to scrape out a living. And so you did not maybe have the access to books and to learning to read and write that someone with more money might have had. Now, as we know now, and as we knew then, literacy is an important connection to access to education, and access to education equals access to higher paying jobs and more ability to earn money. So there's a direct link between literacy and power and financial means or financial ability. When the printing press launched the print era, we began to see a change. We began to see the lower and middle classes start to have access to books, and there began to be more of a focus on the importance of reading and writing. You also saw with that access, you also saw a change in people starting to question authority and question who had the power and who had the access. In terms of the Black community, this was something that literacy was also an issue. Remember that literacy equals power, equals financial ability and access to financial ability. You recall in the 15th century, most Black people were still considered slaves in America. We're talking about in the United States. So the access to literacy was considerably limited. And you may recall that in slavery times, if to have a slave that could read and write was considered illegal. If you've ever seen the movie, the miniseries Roots, you may recall that when Kizzy, the slave owner's daughter, taught her to read and write, that was a big secret. Why? Because a slave who could read and write would be considered extremely dangerous, because they would have access to the documents, they would be able to read things, they would be able to write things. You may recall that that's how Kizzy got sold, is because it was discovered that she had forged some documents. So the whole issue of literacy was particularly important during slavery times, and that's why it was considered such a dangerous thing and considered to be against the law. But the print era really started to launch a difference in how people viewed the importance of literacy and the importance of books. Now, then after the print era, we have the electronic era. The electronic era, basically we're talking about things like radio and television and film. The telegraph is really considered the beginning of the electronic era. And that was happening in the 1840s, in which media messages were transmitted, through electronic means. And then now we have the digital era. And of course, the digital era includes things like cutting edge things, everything from cable television to the internet. And of course, now we have all sorts of, social media and all that kind of thing. So that's really sort of an evolution of mass communication. And that's it as far as our beginning of our review for Chapter 1.